This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by ShireSociety.com. Join up and move to New Hampshire for more freedom. August 9th, 2020. More New Hampshire news. Some of it under the radar, but not this part. The union leader is reporting something that looks positive on its face. From a pro-freedom perspective, they say, quote, "You know, concerns about race and criminal justice have permeated deeply into society when even mathematicians are riled up about the issue. That happened last month when, according to Popular Mechanics magazine, mathematics professors and experts signed a petition that encouraged their colleagues to stop high-tech collaborations with police." Unquote. Now, obviously, I like the fact that such a thingy has been signed, and I like the fact that the union leader does make the point of drawing attention to the fact that this crisis, this Floyd, I call the Floyd crisis, it is a crisis of both racism and criminal justice misapplication. It's not just about racism, and you know, I mean, being a white dude, it's kind of hard to be objective because I haven't had all the experiences that would give me a broader understanding. If I could have been black for a month, I'd know more. But I really think the country has more of a law enforcement problem than a racism problem, right? I mean, we've been picking at their racism scar for many, many years and making many, many things illegal that are racist, and many, many things will get you fired for just, you know, thinking racist. The country's been on the warpath against racism since the 60s. But it has placed cops on pedestals. I mean, you don't see groups of people putting Klansmen on pedestals, but you see plenty of groups putting cops on pedestals. Even now. So I continue to worry that the Floyd crisis will be a racial thing primarily, as opposed to a justice thing primarily. People have a habit of getting really excited and fired up and useful and active against things that are already defeated, right? We're all against Nazis, right? Because there aren't any to punch us in the face after we've criticized them. I mean, saying there aren't any as an exaggeration, but there's very few. Police, however, are all over the place, and their supporters are even larger in number. And they will rat you out for doing nothing in particular at your house, like maybe living in it, or living in an RV. That happened to a guy in Laconia recently. He has been disallowed from sleeping on his own property because he had an RV that he was sleeping in. He wasn't supposed to be sleeping in an RV, apparently. Some Karen ratted him out, and you would have to imagine this must have ruined him financially. We all live, or we should live if we don't, in constant caution that at any moment in time, someone will pick up their smartphone and inform the ubiquitous police that we're carrying a plant we shouldn't, that we're growing a plant we shouldn't, that we're entering a government park that we're not supposed to, or wearing too many clothes or not enough clothes. These days it's usually not enough clothes that gets you arrested, but that was different. That was different a few years ago. You could get arrested or patted down for having too many clothes on. Nowadays, they go after the not-enoughs. But anyway, the article goes on to say that the police are attempting to create, sort of minority report, predictive policing. Some of it doesn't exactly look like a war crime, but, quote, part of predictive policing includes crime mapping, such as this, taken from the Manchester City website. The software plots the data on a map, and the police flood the area with hotspot patrols. They are often areas with high concentrations of minorities. You don't want to be walking in a hot spot and texting, because in such a high crime areas, because in such high crime areas, any slightly suspicious behavior becomes probable cause to stop and frisk someone, said Kim Cosick, a defense lawyer who practices in Manchester, unquote. Apparently, one of the things that gets police suspicious is constantly looking at one's phone. Well, I guess everyone under 20 must be suspicious then, all the time. Anyway, back to the is it a race problem or is it a criminal justice problem question. Well, another way to look at it, there's a list of things. There's a list over 200,000 pages long in the United States. I think it's probably more like 2 million, but we don't actually know how long the list is. No one's ever counted it. But we can agree it's over 200,000 pages. A list over 200,000 pages long of things you're not allowed to do in the United States. And there's another list, I think about 40,000 pages long, in New Hampshire, of things you're not allowed to do. But by and large, with probably one or two exceptions that will be rooted out over the years, and people will become outraged over them as they discover them, it's probably more than one or two. A small number of things. There's probably a very small number of things on this list that are racial in nature, right? Like racist laws. They're probably out there, but they're sufficiently rare, especially if directed against minorities. They're sufficiently rare as to be almost unheard of and unknown, and expunged from the record, overturned over the years. But the rest of these things, these non-racial malum prohibitum, victimless crime laws and so forth, which most of these laws are, those constitute the bulk, right? The vast bulk of the laws. And that, I think, makes my point for me, that we have more of a too many laws, too much enforcement problem than we have a race problem in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean the race problem won't eat all the other problems anyway, because it could grow, right? I mean, there was not a major race problem in Bosnia in 1980. There was an economic problem, and that in turn triggered a constitutional crisis where the central government tried to seize more power from the republics. It was only at that point that the race problem became a bigger deal than all the other problems, and is now the only one that is remembered by most people. So it's like a virus. Racism, whichever ethnicity it's directed against, it's like a virus, and it doesn't really necessarily do that much, at least in the United States, it doesn't do that much most of the time, but if the virus multiplies enough and takes over enough parts of the body, then different story. Racism against minorities, at least black folks and Hispanic folks in the United States, has been pretty heavily kicked to the curb to the extent that it's driven underground. It still drives people's hidden actions because many of them are scared of black and Hispanic folks if they're dressed a certain way or in a certain neighborhood. But it isn't something that's really allowed to operate freely. The only racism in the United States that's allowed to operate freely would be racism against Asians and racism against white folks, best I can tell. You can say racist things against white folks all day long and no one will punish you for that generally. And you should be able to do that. And of course universities tend to, massively discriminate against Asian folks because if they didn't, then probably they think their numbers would get skewed and they would look like they're not diverse enough. Their quotas are not being met because they're, giving Taiwanese gals what they earned and, treating them on merit rather than on quotas and racism. So probably the bigger danger in the U.S. is the bigger racial danger in the U.S. is any racial danger that is tolerated, right? If it's easy to get away with a certain type of racism, that must be the type of racism that is the most dangerous. So I have to conclude, if I'm being logical, that anti-white racism is probably currently the biggest racial danger. That was not the case before 1970, and it may not be the case in 2040, but it is the case now. Fortunately, with white folks being the majority in the United States, that creates a sort of decentralization of power, or a balance of terror, if you want to call it that. If the most populous group is the one that is driven to caution and it's the most criticized and so forth, well, that's a lot better than having the outlier minority groups, one or two of those singled out. Like, for instance, Jews were a very small minority, or a fairly small minority in Germany, and everyone seemed to be against them. That was a deadly combination. But if it had been but now with the shoe on the other foot in Germany, where typical Saxon type folks are the majority, and yet they're pretty cautious, because of the world smacking them down. The majority in Germany isn't able to get away with as much. And in the same way, in the United States, the majority of white folks, they're not able to get away with that much because they are, anything that they do that's racist against, especially black folks or Hispanic folks, they're easily going to lose their job over it. As happened to that lady in Nashua who, went on a racist, well, I haven't seen the video, but it was an allegedly racist rant against, landscaping people because they were speaking Spanish. Yeah, she didn't just lose her job. She lost, there was a job she was paying to do, and they took that away from her too. She's not even allowed to pay to be on the radio anymore, at least not in Nashua. So this keeps the majority in check. Usually you want the majority to be in check in any society. So I still haven't been able to figure out, there's all these different pros and cons about the whole Floyd thing, but I still cannot make myself think that the BLM developments over the last 7 years are going to be a net negative for the United States. The number of deaths they've caused is very small, if any. It appears to be below, in the single digits, if at all. And again, it depends on how you count each death. Who was at fault if someone was killed during a protest or a riot? Apparently back in the 60s, everyone was kind of united in the riot process. Nowadays, the BLM folks, I can't name a single BLM person who has advocated for a riot or for destroying some bystander's property. Unless I'm missing something, I don't know of any reason to blame them for that happening. They can't control everyone in the town, right? Who just happens to see that there's a big protest and that the police are distracted, and they use it as an opportunity to loot. That's going to happen, and you better not be blaming people who are against it. And other than maybe scheduling a demonstration, didn't do anything to enable it. We're supposed to be able to schedule demonstrations. So anyway, I still think we get a net benefit from this whole BLM stuff. I don't think the stuff they did in 2014 more locally, in the South, had a net negative effect. It didn't seem to get rid of over-policing, but now it's so big that governments are scrambling to get rid of over-policing. The decentralization of power has been improved, not reduced. But I'm on the lookout for, and we should all be on the lookout for, the government's typical approach of taking this demand for police reform and turning it into some expensive program, turning it into some ban on speech, turning it into some new ethnic quota process. But so far, the main common denominator thing that I seem to hear, the most common policy change that I hear advocated as part of the BLM movement is defunding the police. And unlike Ron Paul, I am thrilled with that idea. I'm completely supportive. I've appeared in front of government, elected bodies and given speeches advocating that they do this to their police. Many years ago, before there was a BLM. So, despite the fact, Ron Paul is worried that, the defunding of the police could result in, these, minority neighborhoods not getting calls, not getting police to show up for major violent crimes. Okay, maybe that's what the police will do. I don't know. All I know is that if you give them money, you're stealing from the taxpayer to give them that money. Under the current system, that's how it works, with very few exceptions. We need to focus on that initial act of aggression and eliminate that and worry about the effects of it later. Or, maybe we worry about it now, but we still get rid of that spending. All government spending is wrong because it is all brought about by taxation. I mean, again, with the very few exceptions. There are all kinds of ways to protect neighborhoods and reduce crime without using tax dollars. And while a defunding of a police department could create a power vacuum, it's not like we don't have plenty of time to prepare for it. It's on the radar and has been now for months. This is going to be a real opportunity for organizations like the Threat Management Center in Detroit, which has already, had to deal with with an area in which police reduced their level of activity and went into 9-to-5 mode. Those could spread all over the country. And one problem can solve the other, right? If you don't have a job, well, you can create a job by starting a security organization for your neighborhood. Privately funded and or voluntary. But sadly, it's often the case that it's the rich neighborhoods that do the best job of defending themselves because they have the most to lose. And of course, neighborhoods that don't have much to lose, they don't do as much to protect their neighborhood. Speaking of governments trying to use the Floyd crisis as an opportunity to increase spending, here are some results from the New Hampshire Governor's Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency. So their 45-day study has resulted in the following recommendations. Quote, increase the NH Police Standards Training Council staff. Abolish the part-time police academy. Oh, that might save money. Create memoranda of understanding between school districts and law enforcement agencies that would guide the behavior of school resource officers. Standardize the state's required annual police training. Double the minimum hours of annual training, including issues such as bias and diversity and use of force training. That would cost money. Increase scenario-based training. Provide the ethical policing is courageous and active bystander law enforcement training developed by the New Orleans Police Department. Oh, what could go wrong? Adopt uniform training for SWAT teams that includes mental health and de-escalation training. Adopt nationally accepted standards for school resource officer training. Yeah, most of that stuff looks like it's going to cost money. We will reduce the amount of aggression we are committing by way of cracking heads, and the way we do it is to commit more aggression against taxpayers by stealing more money from them, or at least spending more of their money. Though I guess they could get that money from, and should get that money from, a process of reducing their other activities, the fascistic activities. Spend less on that, right? Just stop arresting people for marijuana completely. Just stop it. And cocaine and heroin while you're at it. That'll save you some money. You can free it up for all these expensive programs you're proposing. Again, all this information was in an article in the where was that article? It was in the Oh, the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. They're pointing out that the report stopped short of recommending broader reforms, quote, such as repealing laws that grant police immunity from civil lawsuits, barring union contracts from including procedural protections not afforded average citizens accused of crimes, making police discipline files public, and mandating the use of body cameras, unquote. So, the police still keep their immunity from civil lawsuits. They still can use union contracts to give them special protections that average citizens don't have. They can keep their bad behavior files secret. That's, if the recommendations from this governor's commission are followed. It's really pretty crappy stuff, considering you got cities all over the country that are trying to actually eliminate their police departments. This is just same old, while the rest of the world is going through what could be some very positive changes. And continued, but completely unrelated, or somewhat unrelated, New Hampshire news. Jackie Perry reports this on Facebook. Quote, breaking news. The Libertarian Party of New Hampshire has prevailed in our ballot access pandemic relief lawsuit against Governor Sununu, and we've been granted a 35% reduction in the signatures requirement, unquote. Ugh. That's what passes for a victory when you're the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire? Now they still have to go out and spend, 400 hours, man hours getting thousands of signatures. I would have. I don't know. How many signatures does Emperor Sununu have to get? How many signatures does that other guy, the commissar, or that Trotsky guy that's running? How many signatures does he have to get? None! Thank you, government, for laying out this very difficult and time-consuming path for us to waste our time walking down. We will now walk down it and accomplish almost nothing. You think what could be done with those man hours, right? I mean, you could start a mid-sized company with 400 man hours of labor, right? A company that competes with the government in some service. Or you could start a cryptocurrency, or you could start a nonviolent revolution. Instead, they're going to do something that no one's going to pay any attention to, that is going to have no effect on the election, except maybe to throw it to one party or another. Usually it throws it to the authoritarian, or would be expected to. Now you know why people don't spend much time on Libertarian Party stuff, and the Libertarian Party is not powerful. Because that is not the method we use to get our freedom. That is not the path that's going to lead us there. Relative freedom, when and if it comes, will probably come through one of the major parties, as it did in Russia, in 1990. Yeltsin was a prominent Communist Party member. Or it's going to come through providing alternative services to government, or it's going to come through a civil rights type revolution, civil disobedience, nonviolent revolution type thingy, or secession. Now these things all have track records of working at some point in time, at some point in some place in the world. Libertarian Party does not. However, as long as they're doing stuff, and I am able to practically do so, I will publicize their activities, because at least they're doing something. Speaking of secession, this article from New Hampshire Public Radio, or at least it's an excerpt from nhpr.org. Quote, days after President Trump commuted the prison sentence of his associate Roger Stone, supporters of a Rochester man serving a 7-year term for his role in a 2014 armed standoff in Nevada are asking for the same executive action. In 2016, Jerry Delemus pled guilty to 2 charges stemming from his involvement in an armed standoff with federal agents at the ranch of Clive and Bundy. A group of his supporters gathered Monday in the driveway of Republican Senate candidate Don Bolduc. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. A retired U.S. Army general, to call on Trump to release Delemus, who is being held in a minimum security facility in Ayer, Massachusetts. I implore the President of the United States, please, sir, we saw you do a commutation of a sentence of Mr. Stone. Please do the same for Jerry Delemus, Bolduc told reporters. Delemus maintains his involvement in the Nevada standoff was solely to keep the peace. His supporters say he agreed to plead guilty to the federal charges to spare longer prison sentences for others who joined Bundy. A judge later denied his request to alter his plea. Unquote. Okay, so that's just part of the article there, but I do want to mention a couple things. First of all, they gave him, the judge, I believe, increased his prison sentence because of to punish him for merely asking to change his plea, right? And also, this, his decision to plead guilty and spare others. I think he was right to realize later that was a mistake. You don't, when you're in a hostage situation, you do not reward the hostage taker, right? If there's a way to avoid it, if there's bad guys and you're dealing with them and they're threatening you, you make them choose between, how do I put this? It's better, I think, to make them use their power or back down. Or, maybe, if possible, find some graceful way out that doesn't hurt anybody. But when people start, threatening your family or your friends or whatnot, you shouldn't be nicer to them for doing that, right? It should escalate your activity against them. I don't know if I can continue practicing this philosophy for the rest of my life. Maybe I will be pressured successfully into not doing that. I don't know, but that's how it looks to me kind of from the outside. Hopefully I can live up to that philosophy. But anyway, the reason this is connected to the secession issue is that, and of course, these people who are, hacking at the branches and trying to get this one branch to fall off and still not succeeding, they've forgotten that the root of the problem is Union rule over New Hampshire. If the Union did not rule here, the Union could not arrest people here. It couldn't send a SWAT team to Jerry Delemus' house. Not legally, anyway. And if we had a stronger secession movement, they would consider, they would reconsider some of these attacks, right, that they have levied against New Hampshire residents. Each attack would strengthen the New Hampshire freedom movement. And in truth, each attack that they currently undertake against New Hampshire residents slightly strengthens NH-exit, which of course is not very strong to begin with, but when they do this, it gives me a chance to increase activity on our website, increase publicity for our movement, and, if this movement were to, at some point, increase in size tenfold, if its level of activity was to go up by a factor of 10, that would, in fact, be enough to make us part of every federal calculation when they decide whether to make an arrest, especially an arrest that is tinged with politics, like Jerry Delemus's was. Those arrests would get additional scrutiny, and some of them, I'm sure, would not happen if we could just make it to the 10x mark. Meanwhile, the part that I can do is to continue publicizing these grievances on talk radio here on the channel, on talk radio here on the Ridley Report, and on nhexit.com. And memo to my federal friends: the fewer unjust arrests you make, the less I will have to talk about, the less NH-exit there will be. The solution to tridding us And making us irrelevant is simply to do less harm to New Hampshire residents. Fewer arrests, fewer land grabs, fewer bans on activity. Again, your list of things we're not allowed to do is 200,000 pages long. There's no need to make it longer. And that's the reason why independence is, such an attractive, option for some New Hampshireites. At one stroke, we would be rid of that 200,000 page list of banned things. That 200,000 plus page long list of things we're not allowed to do. Oh, by the way, going back to the Delemus case, I've been talking about this for 6 years, I think, almost, or reading about it, and actually more like 5 years. But I still don't actually know what he was accused of doing. Like, what did he do? Nothing significant enough that I can even remember what it was. I think he was charged for showing up, wearing camos, and being armed. I think that's what it was. They thought he looked scary. Again, London would not do this to someone who's Scottish, right? Well, I mean, if they did exactly the same things as Jerry Delemus, then yes, they probably would. They probably would do so. Just because guns are so heavily banned in Great Britain. But the point is, London wouldn't do something to a Jerry Delemus type figure in Scotland who was doing something that was kind of a mainstream American thing to do, right? A mainstream Scottish thing to do, right? This guy was doing a mainstream New Hampshire thing, a mainstream American thing. It's pretty normal to wear camos and be armed. London would not easily be able to arrest a Scottish person for doing something that was considered acceptable in Scotland, the way that camos and weaponry are considered acceptable in the United States. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And the reason London can't do that to Scottish people easily is because it's always nervous that it's going to tip Scotland over the edge and Scotland's actually going to vote for independence. That strong independence movement, whether it actually achieves independence or not, is very good at achieving concessions from the central government and, more importantly, deterring the central government from abuses inside Scotland. Sometimes I think, in fact, despite technically being a secessionist, the best result we could get in the United States, in New Hampshire in particular, would be actually not independence or secession, but a situation kind of like Scotland has or Quebec has, where yes, there's a strong independence movement, but no, there is never a need to go through the disruption of independence because the central government respects you enough never to trigger you. That might be a better outcome than outright independence. And we don't know right now. I mean, maybe the results that have obtained in Quebec are in fact better than what they would have gotten if they'd had independence. Maybe the results that have obtained in Scotland are better than what they would have obtained if they'd achieved independence. What if the Estonia situation had played out differently in the 80s, and instead of just Gorbachev, you got like a really, really nicer version of Gorbachev. You got someone in power who was sort of a Franz Ferdinand figure and really wanted, federalism for the Soviet Union. I don't think Ferdinand was a Democrat, but let's say that person was also a democracy person, who wanted full-blown democracy for the former Soviet. And they were able to hold the Soviet Union together as a democracy, or a democratic republic. And Estonia remained in it, and all these countries remained in it. As long as they had a lot of autonomy within this sort of union, we can't say for certain that would have been an inferior outcome, even for Estonia, which has done the best. I mean, right now, if you look at Estonia, it's not bad there, but they live in constant fear of, Russian intrusion. They've probably gotten too close to NATO. You have, basically a dictator running Russia. Would it have been better if these republics had not been pushed to the point where they had to declare independence in order to have any hope? Who knows? The part we do know is that it is good to have a strong independence movement. Whether you drop the hammer or not, you gotta have it in your hand.
If you love liberty, declare your independence by signing the Shire Society Declaration at shiresociety.com.